August 15, 1940. 11:30 hours. WAF Corporal Gladys Turner sat in front of her cathode ray tube display at RAF Bawdsey, watching a green glow that most people wouldn't understand. But Turner understood it perfectly. That green spike on her screen, growing stronger every few seconds, meant death was coming. A lot of it. She keyed her headset microphone. Massive formation bearing 095, range 110 miles, height approximately 15,000 feet. Count estimated 100-plus aircraft. Designate Raid 47. Her voice was calm, professional, giving no hint that she'd just detected the largest German air raid yet attempted against Britain. 100 miles away, across the North Sea, over 100 Luftwaffe bombers and fighters were heading toward the English coast. Their crews thought they were invisible, approaching under radio silence, flying in formations designed to overwhelm British defenses. They had no idea that a 19-year-old woman in a concrete bunker was tracking their every move. Within 90 seconds of Turner's report, the information was transmitted to Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory. Within 3 minutes, RAF controllers were scrambling Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons from 4 different airfields. Within 10 minutes, 48 British fighters were climbing to intercept. By the time the German formation crossed the English coast at 11:52 hours, RAF fighters were already positioned at altitude, waiting. The Germans flew into an ambush they never saw coming. The ensuing battle, later called the Greatest Day because of the massive scale of combat, resulted in devastating German losses. The Luftwaffe lost 75 aircraft that day. The RAF lost 34. But the real victory wasn't the kill ratio. It was that the RAF had been waiting. They hadn't been caught on the ground. They hadn't scrambled blindly. They'd known exactly where the Germans were, how many there were, and when they'd arrive. The Germans couldn't understand it. How did the British always seem to know they were coming? German intelligence officers pored over captured RAF documents, interrogated downed pilots, analyzed British radio traffic. Some suspected spies were reporting German takeoff. Others thought the British had broken their code. A few noticed the strange tall towers along the English coast and wondered if they were relevant. But none of them fully grasped what was actually happening. The British had built an invisible shield. A network of radio towers that could see aircraft over 100 miles away, integrated into a command system that could direct fighter squadrons with unprecedented precision. The system was called Chain Home, and it was about to change warfare forever. To understand why Chain Home mattered, you have to understand the nightmare scenario Britain faced in the 1930s. For the first time in history, an enemy could strike the British homeland directly from the air, bypassing the Royal Navy that had protected the island for centuries. The bomber, British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin declared in 1932, will always get through. It was a terrifying assessment, but it seemed accurate. Air defense in the early 1930s relied on sound detectors. Large concrete acoustic mirrors that could hear approaching aircraft and human observers scanning the sky with binoculars. These systems had fatal limitations. Sound detectors could detect aircraft maybe 10 to 15 miles away, and only if weather conditions were favorable and the aircraft were loud enough. By the time defenders heard bombers approaching, there were maybe 5 to 8 minutes before bombs started falling. Not enough time to scramble fighters, climb to altitude, and intercept. Human observers were even more limited. You could only see aircraft when they were close enough to spot visually, maybe 5 to 10 miles on a clear day, less in poor weather or at night. And Britain's weather was rarely clear. Fog, clouds, rain, and darkness made visual observation unreliable at best. The practical result was that air defense was essentially impossible. Bombers could approach at high altitude, deliver their bombs, and be gone before defenders could react. Cities would burn. Civilians would die. And there was no effective defense. British war planners in 1934 ran simulations of a German air attack on London. Their conclusions were apocalyptic. They estimated that in the first week of bombing, London would suffer 66,000 deaths and 133,000 casualties. The psychological impact would be catastrophic. Panic would spread. The government might collapse. Britain could be knocked out of a war in weeks without a single German soldier landing on British soil. This wasn't paranoid fantasy. The Spanish Civil War, which began in 1936, demonstrated exactly what modern bombers could do to cities. Guernica was destroyed by German bombers in 1937, killing hundreds in a matter of hours. The bombing of Barcelona in 1938 killed over 2,500 civilians. The message was clear. Cities were now battlefields, and civilians were targets. The British government began preparing for the worst. They started building air raid shelters. They organized civil defense. They expanded the Royal Air Force. But none of this addressed the fundamental problem. Without early warning, without the ability to detect incoming raids in time to respond, air defense was futile. You couldn't intercept what you couldn't see coming. British scientists and military planners desperately searched for solutions. Could you hear bombers earlier? Could you see them from further away? Could you detect them through clouds and fog and darkness? In 1934, the Air Ministry established the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defense, chaired by physicist Henry Tizard. The committee's mission was to explore any and all scientific approaches to air defense. One committee member, physicist Robert Watt, was the superintendent of the radio research station. Watt had been studying how radio waves interacted with atmospheric phenomena. He knew that aircraft could reflect radio signals. He'd observed it as interference in meteorological research. In January 1935, the Air Ministry asked Watt a specific question that seemed like science fiction. Could radio waves be used to create a death ray that would destroy enemy aircraft? Watt did the calculations and concluded that a death ray was impossible. The amount of radio energy needed to damage an aircraft at useful ranges was far beyond what any transmitter could generate. But the calculations also revealed something else. Something extraordinary. Robert Watt realized that while radio couldn't destroy aircraft, it could detect them. His calculations showed that a radio transmitter broadcasting powerful signals would create echoes when those signals bounced off metal aircraft. By measuring the time delay between transmission and echo, you could calculate the distance to the aircraft. By measuring the direction the echo came from, you could determine the aircraft's bearing. Combine distance and bearing, and you had a position. Watt called this concept RDF, radio direction finding. Later, it would be called radar, radio detection and ranging. On February 12, 1935, Watt sent a memo to the Air Ministry titled Detection and Location of Aircraft by Radio Methods. The memo was just 4 pages, but it outlined a concept that would change warfare. He proposed building transmitters that would broadcast continuous radio signals. Receivers would detect echoes from aircraft and measure the time delay. A skilled operator could interpret the echoes to determine range and bearing. The memo was revolutionary, but it was also speculative. Watt hadn't actually built a working system. He was proposing theory, not proven technology. The Air Ministry faced a decision. Invest resources in an unproven concept based on physics that most military officers didn't understand? Or focus on conventional air defense improvements? The committee decided to give Watt a chance to prove his concept, but the test would be brutal. He had less than 1 month to demonstrate that radio detection actually worked. If he succeeded, he'd get funding for development. If he failed, the concept would be abandoned, and Britain would face the bomber threat with no new solutions. Watt and his assistant Arnold Wilkins worked frantically. They didn't have time to build new equipment, so they improvised. The BBC had a powerful shortwave radio transmitter at Daventry. Watt calculated that if his theory was correct, aircraft flying near Daventry should create detectable echoes in the BBC's broadcast signal. On February 26, 1935, just 14 days after submitting his memo, WWII conducted the critical test. He positioned a receiver in a field 8 miles from the BBC transmitter. An RAF bomber flew a predetermined course between the transmitter and receiver. WWII and Wilkins watched their cathode ray oscilloscope, a device that displayed electrical signals as visible traces on a screen. And there it was. A spike on the oscilloscope that appeared when the bomber was in position, moved as the bomber moved, and disappeared when the bomber landed. They'd done it. They detected an aircraft using radio waves from 8 miles away. The Air Ministry observers witnessed the test and immediately recognized its significance. This wasn't a death ray, but it was something better, a way to see the invisible, a way to detect aircraft through clouds, fog, darkness, and distance, a way to give defenders the early warning they desperately needed. Within weeks, WWII received funding to develop a practical radar system. He established a research station at Orfordness on the Suffolk coast, where his team could experiment with transmitters and receivers overlooking the North Sea. The technical challenges were immense. The Daventry test had detected an aircraft at 8 miles. Useful air defense required detection at 50 miles minimum, preferably more. That meant far more powerful transmitters, far more sensitive receivers, and far better methods of interpreting the echoes. WWII's team worked with obsessive focus. They experimented with different radio frequencies, trying to find the optimal wavelength for aircraft detection. Too short, and the signals didn't travel far enough. Too long, and the echoes were too weak to detect. They tested different antenna designs, trying to maximize transmitted power and reception sensitivity. They developed techniques for measuring echo timing with split-second precision. By September 1935, they'd achieved detection ranges of 40 miles. By December, 60 miles. By mid-1936, they were reliably detecting aircraft at over 100 miles. But range wasn't the only challenge. The system also needed to provide accurate information. Just knowing that aircraft were somewhere out there wasn't useful. Defenders needed to know exactly where the aircraft were, how high they were flying, how many there were, and what direction they were heading. This required sophisticated analysis of the radar echoes. WWII and his team developed techniques for measuring aircraft altitude by analyzing how the radar signal reflected off the aircraft at different angles. They created methods for estimating the number of aircraft by analyzing echo strength. They trained operators to read the cathode ray displays and extract actionable intelligence from the green traces and spike. By 1937, the system was mature enough for operational deployment. The Air Ministry approved construction of a network of radar stations along the eastern and southern coasts of Britain, the areas most vulnerable to German air attack. The network was called Chain Home, because it created a chain of overlapping radar coverage protecting the home islands. Construction of the Chain Home network was an engineering challenge as significant as the radar technology itself. Each Chain Home station required 4 massive transmitter towers, 350 feet tall, taller than any structure most people had ever seen. The towers had to be precisely positioned and perfectly vertical, because even slight tilting would affect radar coverage. They had to withstand North Sea storms that could generate wind speeds over 100 miles per hour. And they had to be built quickly because war was coming. Construction crews worked around the clock through 1937 and 1938. Massive wooden towers were erected at sites along the coast from Southampton to Scotland. Each tower was a lattice structure, looking like 4 telephone poles lashed together and stretched to absurd height. At the top of each tower were the transmitter antennas, wire arrays that broadcast the radar pulses. Between the transmitter towers were smaller receiver towers, 240 feet tall, which hosted the receiving antennas that detected the echoes. The stations also required substantial ground facilities. Transmitter buildings housed the radio equipment, vacuum tube transmitters that generated pulses of radio energy at 20 to 30 megawatts peak power. Receiver buildings contained the sensitive detection equipment and the cathode ray tube displays where operators would track aircraft. Power stations provided the massive electrical power needed to run the transmitters. Backup generators ensured the stations could operate even if the electrical grid was damaged. By September 1938, during the Munich crisis when war with Germany seemed imminent, 5 chain home stations were operational. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and Britain declared war, 20 stations were operational, providing radar coverage of the entire eastern and southern approaches to Britain. The network could detect aircraft from the North Sea to the English Channel, from sea level to 30,000 feet, at ranges exceeding 100 miles. But the chain home stations had limitations that would become critically important during the Battle of Britain. The radar operated at relatively long wavelengths, which meant it had poor low-altitude coverage. Aircraft flying below 1,000 feet could often slip under the radar. The system also had difficulty determining the precise number of aircraft in a formation. Operators could tell if a raid was small, medium, or large, but precise counts were difficult. And the stations were fixed and vulnerable. The massive towers were visible for miles and couldn't be camouflaged or moved. German bombers could target them, and if enough stations were destroyed, gaps would appear in the radar coverage. To address some of these limitations, Britain developed a supplementary system called Chain Home Low (CHL), using different radar technology that could detect low-altitude aircraft. CHL stations began deployment in 1939, providing coverage of the low-altitude approaches that chain home missed. The physical network was impressive, but it was only half of the innovation. The real revolution was what Britain did with the radar information. This is where Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding entered the story. Dowding commanded RAF Fighter Command, responsible for air defense of Britain. He understood that radar detection was only valuable if you could turn that information into action quickly enough to matter. An aircraft detected at 100 miles range would cross to the British coast in about 20 minutes if traveling at 300 miles per hour. Fighter aircraft needed 10 to 15 minutes to scramble, take off, climb to altitude, and reach interception positions. That left a window of only 5 to 10 minutes for human decision-making. The information had to flow from radar operators to commanders to fighter squadrons with absolute minimum delay. Dowding created an integrated command and control system that military historians consider as revolutionary as radar itself. The system worked like this. Chain home stations detected incoming aircraft and immediately reported range, bearing, altitude, and estimated numbers to a filter room at Fighter Command Headquarters. The filter room staff, mostly Women's Auxiliary Air Force (WWII) personnel, correlated reports from multiple radar stations to create a single accurate picture of each raid, eliminating duplicate reports and false contact. The filtered information went to the operations room, a large hall with a huge map table showing all of Britain. WAF plotters wearing headsets would move markers on the map table representing enemy raids and friendly fighter squadrons. RAF controllers sitting in a gallery overlooking the map table could see the entire tactical situation at a glance. Based on what they saw on the map table, controllers would issue orders to sector commanders, who controlled groups of fighter airfields. Sector commanders would scramble squadrons from specific airfields, giving pilots vectors to intercept enemy raids. The fighter pilots, once airborne, received continual updates from ground controllers via radio, directing them toward the enemy. The entire system operated with brutal efficiency. From initial radar detection to fighters being scrambled typically took 3 to 5 minutes. From scramble to fighters reaching interception altitude took another 10 to 12 minutes. A raid detected at 100 miles could be intercepted 50 to 60 miles from the coast, long before reaching British cities. This gave Britain a capability no other nation possessed in 1940, the ability to concentrate defending fighters at the exact time and place where enemy raids would arrive, rather than flying standing patrols that wasted fuel and pilot endurance. The system's sophistication extended to how Britain allocated its fighter resources. Doubting divided Britain into groups, geographical commands each responsible for defending specific areas. 11 Group defended London and the southeast, the most threatened area. 12 Group defended the Midlands. 13 Group defended the north. Each group had multiple sectors, each controlling several airfields. This hierarchical structure allowed for coordinated response to raids at multiple scales. A small raid might be handled by one sector scrambling one squadron. A massive raid might trigger a coordinated response from multiple sectors in multiple groups. But the doubting system's most important feature was that it allowed the RAF to fight defensively with interior lines. The Germans had to commit to attacking specific targets before they knew where British fighters would be. The British could wait until German intentions were clear, then concentrate fighters at the threatened point. This force multiplier allowed the outnumbered RAF to achieve local air superiority at critical times and places, even though the Luftwaffe had overall numerical superiority. Training personnel to operate the doubting system was an enormous undertaking. WWII plotters had to learn to read raid markers quickly and move them accurately on the map table. Controllers had to learn to assess tactical situations instantly and make snap decisions about which squadrons to scramble. Filter room staff had to learn to correlate conflicting reports from multiple radar stations and determine which contacts were real. Radar operators had to learn to interpret the green traces on their cathode ray displays and estimate range, bearing, altitude, and numbers from what were often ambiguous signals. By summer 1940, thousands of personnel had been trained. The system had been tested in exercises and small-scale actions. But nobody knew how it would perform under the sustained pressure of a major German air offensive. They were about to find out. July 10, 1940. This date is generally recognized as the beginning of the Battle of Britain, though German air attacks on British shipping and coastal targets had been ongoing since late June. The Luftwaffe's strategy in this initial phase was to attack British convoys in the English Channel, forcing RAF fighters to come out and fight over the water where downed British pilots would be lost even if they survived being shot down. Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, believed he could destroy RAF fighter command in a matter of weeks through sustained combat. Once British fighter defenses were eliminated, German bombers could attack British cities, ports, and factories at will, breaking British morale and forcing surrender or negotiated peace. The plan depended on the Germans achieving a favorable kill ratio, shooting down more British fighters than they lost themselves. Over time, simple mathematics would give Germany air superiority. But the math wasn't working out the way Göring expected. The chain-home system gave the British a persistent advantage. German raids would form up over France, cross the Channel, and find British fighters already waiting at altitude. The British weren't being surprised. They weren't being caught on the ground. They were appearing at exactly the right place and time, attacking with altitude and positional advantage, then breaking off before German fighters could engage. Luftwaffe bomber crews started reporting that the RAF always knows we're coming. German intelligence officers tried to figure out why. They knew about the tall towers along the British coast. German reconnaissance aircraft had photographed them. Some intelligence analysts suspected the towers were related to British ability to detect raid. In August 1940, the Luftwaffe began attacking chain home stations, hoping to blind British air defenses. On August 12, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched coordinated attacks on 5 chain home stations as part of Operation Eagle Attack, the intensified air offensive intended to destroy RAF fighter command. German dive bombers hit stations at Pevensey, Rye, Dover, Dunkirk in Kent, not France, and Ventnor. The attacks caused damage. The Ventnor station was knocked offline for several days. Transmitter towers were damaged. Buildings were hit. But the Germans had underestimated the system's resilience. Most stations were back online within hours. British engineers had designed redundancy into the network. If one station went down, neighboring stations could cover the gap. Mobile reserve equipment could be rushed to damaged stations. The towers themselves were harder to destroy than they looked. Bombs had to hit the tower bases directly to bring them down, and the lattice structure meant that even damaged towers often remained standing. More critically, the Germans didn't understand what they were attacking. Luftwaffe intelligence believed the towers were long-range navigation beacons or communication systems. They didn't fully grasp that destroying these towers would blind British air defense. After the August 12th attacks showed limited results, Göring decided that bombing radar stations was a waste of effort and ordered the Luftwaffe to focus on airfields instead. It was one of the most consequential intelligence failures of the war. If Germany had recognized Chain-Holmes' importance and sustained attacks against radar stations, they might have created gaps in coverage that would have seriously degraded British defensive capability. Instead, they left the system mostly intact. The Battle of Britain intensified through August 1940. The Luftwaffe shifted from attacking shipping to attacking RAF airfields, trying to destroy British fighters on the ground and crater runways so fighters couldn't take off. These were the most dangerous days of the battle. German raids of 100-plus aircraft became routine. The RAF was scrambling dozens of fighter sorties per day. Pilots were flying 3 or 4 missions daily, returning exhausted, rearming, refueling, and going back up. The strain on the doubting system was immense. Controllers at Fighter Command had to track multiple raids simultaneously, assess which were feints and which were serious threats, and allocate precious fighter resources accordingly. Radar operators stared at their screens for hours, reporting contacts in endless succession. Plotters moved markers on the map table in continuous motion as raids developed, merged, split, and dispersed. It was mentally exhausting work performed under crushing pressure, knowing that mistakes could mean British fighters sent to the wrong location, leaving real targets undefended. But the system held. Day after day, the RAF met German raids with coordinated interceptions. The Luftwaffe never achieved the surprise they needed. British fighters were always there, forcing German bombers to fight through opposition, disrupting their formations, spoiling their bombing accuracy. The kill ratio remained roughly even, both sides losing pilots and aircraft at similar rate. But Germany needed a favorable kill ratio to win. Even matching British losses meant the Luftwaffe was failing to achieve air superiority. The Chain-Holmes system and doubting system depended on thousands of people whose contributions have often been overlooked in popular histories of the Battle of Britain. The majority of radar operators, filter room staff, and plotters were women, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WWII. These women, many of them teenagers, performed the critical intelligence work that made British air defense possible. At Chain-Holmes stations, WWII radar operators sat in front of cathode ray displays for 6-hour shifts, watching green traces and interpreting echo patterns. The work required intense concentration and specialized skill. Different types of aircraft produced different echo signatures. Altitude affected how the signal reflected. Weather could create false returns. Operators had to distinguish between real aircraft and angels, spurious contacts caused by atmospheric conditions, flocks of birds, or equipment glitches. Corporal Avishern, a radar operator at RAF polling, described her experience in an interview decades later. You stared at that green screen until your eyes burned. Sometimes you'd see a contact, and you'd have seconds to determine if it was real or false. If you called in a false contact, you'd scramble fighters for nothing, wasting fuel and pilot energy. If you missed a real contact, enemy bombers could get through undetected. The pressure was extraordinary. You knew that lives depended on whether you read that screen correctly. When operators detected a contact, they'd immediately report it via telephone to the filter room at Fighter Command. The report included range, measured from the time delay of the echo, bearing, determined by which direction the antenna was pointed, altitude, estimated from signal analysis, and estimated numbers, based on echo strength and pattern. These reports had to be clear, concise, and accurate, delivered under pressure while new contacts were appearing. At Fighter Command Headquarters, filter room staff received reports from multiple radar stations simultaneously. Their job was to correlate these reports into a single coherent picture. If 3 different stations reported contacts at similar ranges and bearings, the staff had to determine if they were tracking the same raid from different positions, or if there were actually 3 separate raids. They'd plot the contacts on a map, compare the data, and use their training and judgment to filter out duplicates and false contact. Section Officer Eileen Younghusband, who worked in the filter room, later wrote, "We'd have information coming in from 10 or 15 radar stations at once, plus reports from observer corps posts, plus updates from our own fighters in the air. You had to process it all instantly, decide what was real and what wasn't, and pass accurate information to the operations room. There was no time for mistakes. Controllers were making life and death decisions based on what we told them." The filtered information went to the operations room, where WAF plotters stood around the huge map table with magnetic markers representing raids and fighter squadrons. As information came in via headsets, plotters would move the markers across the map, showing the real-time position of aircraft. Different colored markers indicated different information: hostile raids, friendly fighters, aircraft identity unknown. Numbers on the markers showed altitude and estimated strength. Controllers sitting in the gallery above could look down and see the entire tactical situation laid out spatially. They could see German raids forming up over France, crossing the Channel, approaching British targets. They could see which British squadrons were already airborne, which were scrambling, which were on the ground refueling. They could see gaps in coverage and threats developing. WAF plotter Patricia Clark remembered. You'd see a hostile marker appear on the French coast, and you'd track it across the Channel, watching it get closer to Britain. You'd see our fighters scramble and climb to intercept. Sometimes you'd see them merge. That meant combat was happening. Sometimes the hostile marker would turn back. Sometimes it would keep coming. You were moving these markers, but you knew each one represented real people, real aircraft, real combat happening right then. The women operating these systems faced danger themselves. Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory was a potential German target. Chain home stations on the coast were bombed repeatedly. Several WAF personnel were killed when stations were hit. Many more continued working through air raids, staying at their posts while bombs fell nearby, because leaving would create gaps in radar coverage. They received minimal recognition at the time. Churchill's famous speech about the Battle of Britain praised the few, the fighter pilots. He didn't mention the radar operators, the plotters, the filter room staff, the telephone operators who kept communication lines open, or the hundreds of other support personnel who made the doubting system function. After the war, most of these women returned to civilian life and rarely spoke about their service. Only in recent decades have historians begun documenting their contributions and recognizing that the Battle of Britain was won not just in the skies, but in the operations rooms and radar stations where women provided the intelligence that made effective air defense possible. September 7, 1940, marked a crucial turning point in the Battle of Britain, though it didn't seem that way at the time. For over a month, the Luftwaffe had been attacking RAF airfields, trying to destroy British fighter capability on the ground. The attacks were having an effect. Several airfields had been heavily damaged. Fighter losses were mounting. RAF pilot strength was becoming critically low. Replacements weren't arriving fast enough to make up for casualties. Some military historians argue that by early September, RAF Fighter Command was approaching a breaking point. If the Luftwaffe had continued targeting airfields for another 2 or 3 weeks, British air defenses might have been seriously compromised. But on September 7th, Hitler and Göring changed strategy. Enraged by RAF bombing raids on Berlin, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to shift from attacking airfields to attacking London. The Blitz, the sustained bombing campaign against British cities, began. From a strategic perspective, this was a catastrophic German mistake. By switching from military targets, airfields, to civilian/industrial targets, cities, the Luftwaffe gave RAF Fighter Command the breathing room it desperately needed to repair damaged airfields, rest exhausted pilots, and bring new fighter squadrons into the line. From the perspective of the doubting system, the shift to city bombing created a different tactical challenge. Raids on London were larger and more concentrated than the dispersed airfield attacks had been. On September 15, 1940, now celebrated as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe launched 2 massive raids on London, with over 400 aircraft in each wave. This was the moment when the doubting system proved its full value. The chain home network detected the German formations assembling over France around 11 o'clock hours. Filter rooms processed the information and identified 2 major raid buildup. Operations rooms tracked the developing threat. By the time the first German wave crossed the English coast at 11:30 hours, 11 RAF squadrons had been scrambled from airfields across southeast England. The British fighters met the German formations before they reached London, engaging in running battles that broke up German bomber formations and forced many to jettison their bombs early or abort their attack runs. The second wave arrived in early afternoon and met an equally coordinated response. By day's end, the Luftwaffe had lost 56 aircraft. The RAF lost 26 fighters, but most of the pilots survived. More importantly, the coordinated defense demonstrated that Germany could not achieve the air superiority needed for invasion. Hitler had been planning Operation Sea Lion, the amphibious invasion of Britain, but it required German air superiority to prevent the Royal Navy from destroying invasion barges crossing the Channel. The events of September 15th, and the continued effectiveness of British air defense throughout September, convinced Hitler that air superiority wasn't achievable. On September 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. Britain would not be invaded. The Battle of Britain continued through October 1940 as the Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing, trying to destroy British industrial capacity and break civilian morale. Night bombing presented new challenges for the doubting system. Chain home could still detect night raids, but darkness made fighter interception far more difficult. British pilots couldn't see enemy bombers at night, and the early air-to-air radar systems weren't yet reliable enough for effective night interception. German bombers did significant damage to London, Coventry, and other cities during the night blitz of 1940 to 1941. But they never achieved the strategic objective of forcing British surrender. British production continued. Morale held. By spring 1941, the Luftwaffe was withdrawing resources from the Western Front to prepare for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Battle of Britain was over. Britain had survived, and the chain home system had been instrumental in that survival. German failure to neutralize or effectively counter the chain home system represents one of the most significant intelligence failures of World War II. The reasons for this failure are complex and reveal important lessons about technology, intelligence, and military decision-making. First, German leadership fundamentally misunderstood what radar was and what it could do. German scientists had actually developed radar technology independently. They had their own radar systems for naval fire control and air defense. But German military commanders didn't appreciate radar's potential as a strategic air defense tool. They viewed it as a technical curiosity, not a war-winning capability. When German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the chain home towers in 1939, Luftwaffe intelligence officers analyzed the images and concluded the towers were probably long-range radio navigation beacons or communication arrays. They didn't recognize them as detection systems. Second, German airmen interpreted their combat experiences through the wrong framework. When British fighters consistently appeared to intercept German raids, Luftwaffe commanders assumed this was due to superior British intelligence gathering from spies, or possibly broken German codes, or just lucky timing. The idea that the British could detect aircraft from 100 miles away using radio waves was outside most German commanders' conceptual framework. Some Luftwaffe officers did suspect radar was involved. General Wolfgang Martini, the Luftwaffe's signals intelligence chief, believed the towers were detection systems and advocated for sustained attacks to destroy them. But his recommendations were overruled by Göring, who didn't understand the technology and didn't believe the towers were important enough to justify continued bombing. Third, even when Germans captured downed RAF pilots who mentioned radar, interrogators often didn't follow up effectively. British pilots were trained to maintain security about radar and the doubting system, but some information did leak in interrogations. German intelligence officers collected this information but didn't synthesize it into a coherent understanding of British air defense capabilities. Fourth, German electronic intelligence efforts were insufficient. The Luftwaffe did have units equipped to detect and analyze British radar transmissions. They knew the towers were broadcasting powerful radio signals, but they underestimated the sophistication of the British system. They detected the transmissions but didn't fully grasp how the British were using echo analysis to determine range and bearing. German electronic warfare doctrine in 1940 was less advanced than British capabilities, and German commanders didn't prioritize developing countermeasures. Fifth, the Luftwaffe made a strategic error in abandoning radar attacks after the limited strikes in August 1940. Those attacks had actually been more effective than Germans realized. The Ventnor station was offline for 11 days, a significant gap in coverage. If Germany had sustained attacks on radar stations, using specialized tactics developed specifically for those targets, they could have created persistent blind spots in British air defense. Instead, they concluded radar stations weren't worth bombing and never developed a coherent counter-radar strategy. Finally, there was an element of arrogance in German assessment. Göring and other Luftwaffe leaders believed German aircrew quality and numerical superiority would simply overwhelm British defenses. They didn't think they needed to understand British defensive systems because they expected to win through brute force. This proved catastrophically wrong. The contrast with later Allied efforts against German radar is instructive. By 1943 to 1944, when Allied bombers were attacking Germany, the RAF and USAF developed sophisticated radar countermeasures. They used electronic jamming to confuse German radars. They dropped strips of aluminum foil to create false radar contacts. They attacked German radar stations with specialized anti-radar missiles. They studied captured German radar equipment to understand its weaknesses. The Allies treated German radar as a critical strategic system that needed to be defeated. Germany in 1940 never reached that level of understanding about British radar. The result was that throughout the Battle of Britain, Chain Home continued operating with high effectiveness, providing the early warning that made coordinated air defense possible. The Chain Home system and the doubting system's success in the Battle of Britain had consequences that extended far beyond 1940. In the immediate term, the survival of Britain meant Hitler faced a multi-front war. Britain remained as a base for eventual Allied liberation of Europe. British survival kept sea lanes open for American supplies. The RAF continued bombing Germany, forcing the Luftwaffe to maintain air defenses in the west even while fighting in the east. In military technological terms, the Battle of Britain demonstrated conclusively that radar-based air defense worked. Every major combatant nation accelerated radar development after 1940. The United States, Soviet Union, Germany, and Japan all developed more sophisticated radar systems as the war progressed. Radar became essential for naval warfare, allowing ships to detect enemy vessels and aircraft beyond visual range. It became critical for bombing accuracy, with radar-equipped aircraft able to bomb through clouds and darkness. The integration of radar into command and control systems, the innovation Dowding pioneered, became the template for modern air defense. The concept of collecting sensor data from multiple sources, filtering and fusing that data at a central location, and using it to coordinate defensive responses is now fundamental to military operations. Modern air defense systems like the U.S. Aegis system or NATO integrated air defense are direct descendants of the Dowding system, using far more sophisticated technology but the same basic operational concept. The role of women in operating technical military systems, demonstrated by WWII personnel in the Battle of Britain, helped break down barriers to women in military and technical roles. While women were largely excluded from combat roles in most militaries until recent decades, their essential contributions to radar operations and command systems in World War II demonstrated their capability in highly technical military functions. From a strategic perspective, the Battle of Britain demonstrated that technological innovation could be a force multiplier for a numerically inferior force. The RAF had fewer fighters than the Luftwaffe, but the advantage provided by radar and the Dowding system allowed Britain to achieve local superiority at critical times and places. This principle, that quality and technological superiority can offset numerical inferiority, influenced post-war military thinking, particularly in the United States and Israel, both of which have emphasized technological edge as a strategic priority. The Battle of Britain also demonstrated the importance of intelligence and counterintelligence. Britain's success in protecting the secrecy of radar's full capabilities, and Germany's failure to correctly assess British air defense systems, shows how intelligence failures can negate military advantages. German numerical superiority and aircrew skill meant little when Germans were consistently flying into ambushes because they didn't understand how the British knew they were coming. The chain home towers themselves mostly survived the war and continued operating in various roles into the 1950s. A few remnants still exist as historical monument. The most intact example is at RAF Stenagott in Lincolnshire, where a chain home tower and some equipment buildings have been preserved. The Bawdsey Manor site, where Watson Watt did much of his pioneering radar work, is now a museum dedicated to radar history. Robert Watson Watt was knighted in 1942 for his contributions to radar development. He continued working on radar technology throughout the war and later wrote several books about radar history. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding retired in 1942 and lived until 1970. His reputation has grown over time as historians have recognized the sophistication of the air defense system he created. Many of the WAF personnel who operated the radar and plotting systems returned to civilian life after the war and received little recognition during their lifetimes. Only in recent years have organizations like the RAF Museum and Battle of Britain Memorial Trust begun systematically documenting their contributions. The scientific principles Watson Watt developed became the foundation for all modern radar. While radar technology has advanced enormously, modern systems use phased arrays, digital signal processing, and sophisticated computer analysis that would be unrecognizable to 1940s operators. The fundamental concept remains the same. Broadcast radio energy, detect echoes from targets, measure time delay to determine range, measure direction to determine bearing. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that wars could be won not just through traditional military virtues of courage and firepower, but through scientific innovation, technological integration, and effective command systems. The invisible shield of radio waves that protected Britain in 1940 was as important as the fighters and pilots everyone could see. In the history of warfare, chain home represents one of the first examples of a sensor network integrated into a command and control system to create what we now call situational awareness, the ability to know what's happening across a wide area in real time and respond coordinately. That capability, pioneered by Watson Watt and Dowding in the late 1930s, is now the foundation of modern military operations across all domains. The The secret radar that helped win the Battle of Britain wasn't just a technical innovation. It was a revolution in how wars could be fought, and its legacy continues shaping military technology and doctrine 80 years later.